Okay. Good evening, everyone. We are live with the Heirloom Foundation with Julian Davis Reid, and we are very excited because today is the first day of spring. And I cannot imagine a better way to bring in spring with a conversation of music. I think spring is quite synonymous with music.
Yes.
Nature begins to sing, right? Right around this time. So
Uh,
very excited and so excited to have Mr. Reed, to have Julian. We're just gonna let people. I see people already kind of popping in, one or two people. So we're just saying good evening and waiting for you all to come in. As you do, please feel free to share. Feel free to share on your social media spaces. I always say this, and I try not to forget. Please make sure you go to our social media. When we are on, it is important that we can gather more and more people who are interested in these conversations and being in these spaces or in the a particular work that we're doing. So I want to just, we're not doing an intro yet, but Julian, which IG would you encourage people to follow?
at Julian Davis Reid.
At Julian
Appreciate
Davis
y'all.
Reid. Yes, yes. And I do encourage you to please follow at the Heirloom Foundation. So I do like to honor time, although I give people time. I give people like maybe a minute, but I want to honor time. And I think people are going to jump in as they can. But we are excited about today. I think you may be our first musician in this space. So I'm just thankful. I'm thankful to God. Most of our conversations are with gardeners and farmers, which are also beautiful and wonderful. But I really wanted to expand our space a bit and let people know that creation, love of God and creation and care go beyond the work of the land.
Mm.
And so that's why we have you here this evening. So before, don't even get into the depth of your work. Just tell us who
Sure.
you are, where you are, a little bit about yourself.
What's going on, everybody? My name is Julian. I'm coming to you from Chicago, and it's a joy to be here to talk about such a needed
Yeah.
convergence point of three really, really important persons, entities in my life: God, nature, and music.
Mhm.
And all three of those sit together for me in the work that I do in my band, the Juju Exchange, but then also in my contemplative retreat that I host called Notes of Rest. And so I'm delighted to be here. Matter of fact, it was through Notes of Rest that I met Dr. Monique. So it's an honor to be
Yes.
here to talk through some of what's going on and maybe even play. We'll see.
Oh, it'd be wonderful if the spirit leads you to. Hey, this is the space for it. But we did indeed meet on during your Notes of Rest retreat, and it's really interesting because I think a lot of people in the pandemic have like attempted to create such spaces
Mm,
for people through through schools and through churches and all of that. But it's hard to create a retreat space virtually, and I have to tell you all. Julian did it that evening. Like it was absolutely beautiful. It was, we weren't in daylight savings, so it was kind of dark. I remember having to stop my car. I was like, let me stop my car and pay attention. And I'm certain he'll give you more details about it. But we just were able to be transported, I think, in and through the book of Psalms and his interpretation of the Psalms through music. And I felt God in that moment. And I
mm.
had to connect. And I was so grateful that, he's big now, but he hasn't gotten too big to connect with
You're
with the
very
little
kind.
people.
You're very kind. That was, that was a special night. And for those of y'all who've been following Heirloom and all that's been happening out of Dr. Monique's head, heart, and soul, you've just seen a brilliant sister doing her thing and inviting people into this ecosystem. A word I use intentionally because what I saw that night when we connected during Notes of Rest was just a vibrant back and forth that could only happen as a result of somebody who's really doing that deep internal work, that gardening of the soul, really. And so,
Absolutely.
Doctor, thank you so much for having me, for being on that session,
Yes.
and for inviting me into this space to do some more telling.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I do remind everyone that when we are in this space, that it is sacred ground. People who come to this space share stories, and those stories are sacred, and we want to receive them in this ground so that at some point they feel like there is some sort of return for having been either vulnerable or open to sharing and guiding us in their own journey. So I remind people of that. And with that reminder, Julian, can we start with talking about like childhood? Where is your first connection in your memory, in your core memory,
Mm,
and with God and nature and music? And it could be one of the three or all three. When did it begin
mhm.
and how?
Yeah, I spent all of my time outside getting banged up, playing football and basketball. Loved the outdoors. Loved playing not only the sports that might be more typical for urban black folk,
Yes.
but also just loving my time out in the woods. My thanks be to God for my parents. You know, they were black parents who like, look, our kids are not going to have an adverse relationship to nature. And so we went to national parks, we went to Acadia, we went to various regions out in California. We went here in the Midwest. We would constantly go on hikes and whatnot. And I loved actually one of my favorite memories, period, hands down, growing up, was going to Malakini Cove. That's one of the few, if not the
Mm,
only place I need to return to in life. Malakini Cove in Hawaii. We went snorkeling there, and I could go down 37 feet, and you could see all the way to the bottom, see the fish, and just that sound, that crinkle, it's just
mm,
beautiful, just
mhm.
taking me into that posture of awe, which
Yes.
then connects me to how I saw that as connected to God, as connected to the glory of a creator who would bring all that together. Me, the fish, 37 feet down, maybe
Yeah.
not that deep. I can't dive that deep, but I was getting down there. It was
Yes.
dope, it was dope. Fast forward though, what started to happen for me with music was in retrospect, the same thing that was happening for me in nature. When I was in spaces that were not human made, there was a sense of peace that surpassed understanding that I couldn't even articulate, but was there.
Mhm.
Similarly, when I played, which was, of course, was on instruments, piano, in settings that were very much human made, there also was a sense of peace that surpassed understanding.
Mm,
And so we'll talk about that more later. But those two places of a peace that surpassed understanding that came from being in nature, and
yes.
then also being in front of a piano or listening to somebody else play,
Yes.
those would then be coordinates on
Yes.
this map of understanding then the convergence of all three that
Yes.
I'm excited to talk with you more about in a second.
That's wonderful. And I love the intentionality that your parents had, when it came to nature and natural spaces. I've talked before with a lot of people about some odd but common aversion
Hmm.
that many of us, of people of color, particularly African Americans in this nation, have to the outdoors, particularly
Yeah,
working outdoors, but just kind of a blase, like I just don't do that.
that's right. That's right.
And
Eh,
what do you think about that? Have you encountered that?
Oh,
In what
tons.
way have you encountered that?
So being middle class, growing up middle class, again rooted in Chicago, there was definitely a vibe I got in many middle class black
Mhm.
bourgeoisie
Yes.
settings, intelligentsia of we done worked enough in the dirt to now no longer have to.
Mhm.
And I think because of the deep trauma around being so deeply embedded in the slavocracy, still
Yes.
part of the erasure of that, or not part of the coping, led
Mhm.
to an erasure of
Mhm.
the deep kind of connection we otherwise could have had still with the land. And
Yes.
so even though I was outside, there often wasn't this impulse or this culture
Mhm.
around creating impulses to work the land, to be really in the dirt as you grew. Maybe
Yes.
when you're really young, it's part of
Yes.
being an infant and
Yes.
close to that stage. But as you get older, of course, you get further and further away from the dirt and then
Yes.
outsource the work that needs to be done in the dirt to other people to then do it on your behalf. And
Yes.
that's part of the climb, the ascent. That's part of having the middle class cachet that
Yes.
many black folk aspire to have. And so it's I saw that, I see that, I feel that,
Mhm.
and I mourn how something
Mhm.
that was so beautiful was so disfigured as a result of
Yes.
greed and excess
Yes.
that happens in this anti-black world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I appreciate what you say about, or what you said about the fact that, as we grow older, we move away from the dirt and we move
Mhm.
away from the physical dirt until we begin to find ourselves buried by societal and economic issues that could
Mhm.
be equated to being covered, right, in dirt. And it's not until those moments, I think, that we reconnect out of
Yeah.
necessity. Um,
Wow.
People, a lot of people that I'm connecting to are like, I had to get my hands in dirt because I was going through it.
Wow.
Because
Wow.
I was being buried by life, I needed to get my hands and I need to go outside,
Yeah. I
you
hear
know?
it.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
definitely hear it. Yeah. And that's uh it's a sad return, but I'm
mhm,
glad the return happens.
yes,
Um and I think that we're living at a vital moment. I'm so glad this exists, Dr.
mhm,
Mo, that you're
me
doing
too.
this, because it's ironic where we are at this intersection for me as a musician, particularly because part of what musicians are always trying to do, especially if you're making new music, is you're really trying to be at the vanguard of technological development,
Mm,
advancement, change, however you want to talk
mm,
about it. But
mhm,
artists are in the business literally of domesticating and making desirable new
mm,
technologies.
mm.
I mean, that's not what we put on our tagline, but that's effectively what you see happening.
Yeah,
Computers, tape machines, you
yeah,
go to the art form, it's
mhm,
all about taking a piece of technology, an instrument,
mhm.
and then turning that into a new form of sound that people want to pay money for and spend
Yeah,
time getting to know and
yes.
really falling in love with. And so that's one thing that's happening. But then what we also see happening, at least what we can see happening, is that musicians can help turn people back to some of the most core primal identities that we have, namely being dirt. So
Yeah,
to think about the relationship between the word human and humility,
yeah.
or the word human and hummus,
Yes.
HUM, how both of those are connected to the dirt. In Hebrew, that's powerful. That's, you get it more clearly than you do in English, and yet I think it's still so relevant to that kind of primacy that music is about. In Hebrew, the word for human, Adam, comes from the word for dirt or soil,
Yeah,
Adamah. And so
yes,
it's very present there. And I try to return to that when I think about what it means to be human is to be dirty, literally
yes,
dirty. And yet, so
yes.
often, how often do we talk about dirt and being
Mhm,
dirty as
mhm.
a very thing to get away from? You're
Right.
dirty, so go clean off, right? Because dirt is something that we're, again, supposed to have an adverse relationship with. So, my hope is that the kind of technological things that musicians are meant to make desirable aren't dwarfed then by the fact that musicians can hopefully also make desirable the things of the world. And
That's
so,
right.
and the things of the earth particularly.
Yes.
And so the record I came out with last November,
Yeah.
Rest Assured,
Mhm.
has as that, oh, there you can see. It
Okay, there
has
you go.
as the album artwork a sparrow, and it comes from my grandma's favorite hymn, His Eyes on the Sparrow, and she had the
Yes.
voice of a sparrow. But it's
Uh,
also meant to point us to the dirt, to point us to the earth, to
right.
point us to that which came before us, and that which is always there to remind us of something, should
Mhm.
we listen.
Absolutely. Should we listen?
Yeah.
And I think that's the other thing I'm hoping and praying that space like this point people back to
Mhm.
is listening to, and
Mm,
being willing to hear and be able to receive what God has already naturally imparted in the earth for us.
my God. Yes.
We have
Y-
so many questions and we have we so many frustrations and issues that are, I wouldn't say solved, but that God speaks into
Yeah.
naturally.
Yeah, no, I hear
Um,
it. And there's this theologian I love. His name is Willie James Jennings. Teaches out at Yale.
I
Yeah.
had I had Jennings at Duke.
Oh shoot.
Powerful. He's a
You know,
powerful theologian. Yes. What is
you know what it is. But one
yes.
thing that he observes, and I'm sure he's not the first,
Mhm.
is that sadly one of the forms of death that we live out now is that over the last 500 years during the colonial era, the world has become inanimate. It's become mute. We don't hear it anymore. That used to not always be the case. We used to hear the sounds of the earth,
Yes.
and we used to respond in kind.
Yes.
But so much in modernity is about muting that
Yes.
kind of volume
Yes.
and then giving extra sound to
Yes.
that which we make
Yes.
ourselves. And we end up missing out on all the deep ways that the earth is speaking. And so I hope that one of these moves in post-colonial life identity that we're all hopefully trying to contend with is that we let the earth sound again, that we
Mm.
listen to the sounds of the earth. Now I gotta be honest, that's an important thing for me to say, but it's also a challenging thing for me to say, because as a musician, part of the logic of the market now is to get you to listen to me. So what does it mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean to get musicians to listen not only to the sounds that we make, earbuds? I mean,
Right.
literally, if you walk around with earbuds on, you are muting the sounds of the earth so as to listen to
Yeah.
this.
Yes.
So how do you mix that kind of sharing, which I still want to have happen, of
Mhm.
course, with then the sharing of the earth? So
Yeah.
one thing that I've tried to do in the band that I'm in, the electronic jazz fusion band, the Juju
Mhm.
Exchange, is that we incorporate these sounds of earth. So for instance, at the end of
Mhm.
our last record, Eternal Boombox, which is a 5-piece EP that
Mhm.
walks through each stage of the 5 theory stages of grief,
Mm.
and the last track is called Glimmer. You have, at the last sound of the whole record, are birds chirping in the rain, um, particularly the rain. And you
Wow.
just hear this rain coming through, and you just hear the sound of what ideally is hope,
Yes.
rain about something springing up, to your point
Yeah.
about today being the first day of spring. So definitely check out that tune, Glimmer, on our record,
Yes.
the Juju Exchanges, The Eternal Boombox. But yeah, that's
Yeah.
speaking to how that's a it's a challenge that musicians are in, but it's hopefully one that we can meet with honesty and transparency, but then also hope as we help people re-listen to the earth.
Yes, yes, I can agree with that, and there is quite the pulling,
Mm,
because, people who become musicians, of course, go into it because they have a heart for, a
yeah.
propensity, a prowess, and it's because there's something life-giving in it, but then you also need to make a living too. So the minute you have to incorporate any economical, financial need
Yeah.
um, with that art, you do start to pull back and forth, and what you hope is that you can find this space, as you mentioned, your band is really finding these spaces where you can bring all of this together.
Yeah.
I want to let you know, so there are a couple people who are talking. So Tiffany Robinson says lockdown was a wonderful opportunity to hear the earth in its natural state without the traffic, people, freight movement. And I have to say, Tiffany, we're on the same page, because I tell people, I said, you all not paying attention. Now we're far from it. When, we locked down the entire world. I have said this so many times. We had locked down. I remember going for maybe a walk, no, it was a walk at that time, not a jog. And it must have been days after we had locked down. Everything felt more alive.
That's right. That's right.
I had
That's right.
never felt the earth the way that I did. You could hear everything. Animals were so much more free and playful. Water was flowing and you could hear it and experience it. The
Yeah.
sky was brighter. This is when you say listening to what God has to say to us through the earth.
Yeah.
Listen to the earth and what earth has to say. The earth was telling us, really kind of screaming, I need to rest.
My God. Not yet. Now you preaching, Doc. You preaching. And
Yeah.
so in my part of what birthed my retreats notes of rest is this whole point, this whole scream that you were
Yes.
just saying from the earth. I will rest. Not only do I need to rest, the earth is saying, with all that is happening, I will rest
Yes.
one way or the other. Either you all can
Yes.
rest with me, or I'm gonna make you rest.
I'm gonna make you rest.
And part of what I was realizing, I remember what I was saying at the beginning about how I had these two kinds of peace that surpassed understanding growing up,
Yes.
right? There
Yeah.
was music, and then there was being in nature,
Hmm.
snorkeling with the
Hmm.
turtles in Hawaii, or
Yes.
going, doing that snorkel dive, Acadia National Park in Maine, seeing the whales, so on and so forth. Well, as time went along, I started to realize that these two places for peace, music and the non-human created world, that those are places that really could come together. And what I
Mm,
started to see in my retreat, and Dr. Monique, you've been to this, and anybody who's interested, you can go to my website,
yes, please.
juliandavisreed.com, check it out. This because this session that Dr. Monique and I had with the Center for Religion and Environment at Sewanee School of Theology, that's up there. But
Mhm.
anyway, the thing I wanted to say was I realized that when we rest, which music can help induce, we then let the earth rest. And but when we're restless, which
Mhm.
sadly music also can induce,
Mhm.
then the earth becomes more restless.
Yes.
So when we decide to take less because we actually realize that we have an abundance already that doesn't require needless striving, needless extraction, needless exploitation, etc. When we take less, then the earth is able to do more because the resources are there for the earth to live in harmony with us and we with it,
Yeah.
or her, or however you want
Yes.
to pronominalize it.
Yes.
But when we are restless and we're constantly moving and constantly moving about, then we end up taking more than we need. And
Right.
so Notes of Rest is in part trying to get at how this ecosystem works one way or the other. We
Yeah.
either live in the ecosystem of restlessness,
Mhm.
which is contagious, or we live in the ecosystem of restfulness, which is
Yeah.
contagious. And reality is we probably live a little bit in both. But
Right.
the retreat gives you space to think about, how am I participating in restlessness and
Yes.
its contagiousness?
Yes.
And then how can I swap that out for a little more restfulness
Yes.
and let that be even more contagious?
Yeah.
Not only for humans, not only for my own sense of self, but also for the sake of my relationship with Earth. And so the music then serves as a vehicle by which you can contemplate such a swap from restless to restful, and also then can even encourage you to desire it. So it
Yes.
accompanies you as you think, but also helps you maybe desire a different way. Because when you desire, when the music is good, then the music and it's restful and it's familiar, then it can bring you into that state where you drop them shoulders. And
Yes.
so that's one of the long-term
Mhm.
goals and desires of mine for Notes of Rest, is that people come and they end up becoming more restful, which means in part not giving themselves over to needless conflict, which the earth then responds to in kind.
That's right. And, I find that, we tend to begin to blame God in the earth
Mm.
when the earth begins to find its balance again.
Oh
As you said
wow.
before, it will rest with or without us. So
Yeah.
when hurricanes and tsunamis rage, and it's trying to find the earth is trying to find its way back to itself, which can feel very violent to us,
Yes, yes, yes.
we begin to point blame.
Wow. That's such a great point and such a sad point. And
Yeah.
I think especially in the global north, and then you think even within the global north or minority world,
Mhm.
you then think even about the people who have the particularly high levels of economic power within it. That anger is about what God is doing or why would this be happening. That anger ends up coming from people who often can shield themselves the best for now
Right now.
from the earth trying to find her way back to
Mhm.
herself.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, the cats in Haiti, the cats in Fiji, the
There you
cats
go.
in New Orleans, lower
There you
ninth
go.
ward, who
Mhm.
are bearing the brunt
Right.
of all of these extractive policies and movements over the last 500 years, they end up having to hum a different tune.
Yes.
Can God be present for me in the midst of the tsunami, in the midst of the hurricane, because
Mhm.
they are really feeling the brunt.
Mhm.
And so part of my vision is to see that we can really take accountability for those of us who are responsible for putting into play the kinds of practices, the
Yes.
kinds of lifestyles, mentalities that then lead to little bit by little bit this kind of degradation of our ability to live and
Yes.
conditions for human flourishing.
Yes.
And I think that's
100%.
so astute to connect that to a misplaced blame on God,
Yeah.
when in fact God and the earth have been working in tandem long before we got here.
Long before, and
And
was created in such
yeah,
a sustainability
yeah,
that if we honored that initial covenant And then as we were brought into that covenant, if we honored it, we would be living as God intended for us to live, and earth and nature and God and us,
Yeah.
we would all be communicating well.
Right. Within harmony, living within
Yes.
that deep community. And so, yeah, I'm excited for Notes to be a space where people can continually think about how are we living in the harmony with the rest of the earth.
Yes.
So one of the sessions I do is around this passage in Exodus, which is towards the beginning of the book, or sorry, towards the beginning of the Bible. And there's a passage that's repeated in Deuteronomy. So sometimes I'll use both, sometimes just one or the other. But in both passages, you see this commandment to the people God's just freed from slavery,
Mhm.
freed from endless work,
Yeah.
to one, rest,
Yeah.
but then two, remember that your rest is not only for you, but also when you rest on that day off, it's
Mhm.
also for those who work for you, and it's also for the animals in your midst and your care.
Yeah.
And the animals, of course, being an extension of non-human creation.
Yeah.
And so that rest in those passages we see very clearly is directed at the ecosystem that you're a part of,
Yeah.
not just you. And yet, so often, what I hear when people talk in today's culture about self-care and
Mhm.
let me take some days off, it's principally about you
Right.
and or about me. And let me just get my time and catch up on my sleep and blah blah. And not connecting it to the deeper ecosystem that you're a part of, realizing like I have, when I don't sleep well,
Yeah.
or when I give myself over to needless conflict, or when I'm overly worried or confused about my purpose or something
Yeah.
else, the earth can end up paying the price because I end up buying more than I need to eat. I
Mhm.
end up driving needless places. I end
Mhm.
up
Driving recklessly and without thought, and so
that's
people
a
are in harm's way.
that's a great point. Or and that ends up wasting more gas. I hadn't even thought about that. That's a
Mhm.
great point, right? If
Mhm.
I'm late to something because I'm not on
Right.
my P's and Q's,
Yeah.
I end up burning more gas, which then
Yeah.
has all these deleterious
Yeah.
effects afterwards. All of that is connected to my sense of restlessness. So it's
Yeah.
not just sleep, but
Yeah.
it's also then how I treat the earth and everything thereof.
And the ecosystem in your house.
Yeah.
In your household, right? We all know how combustible households can be without proper rest and
Mm,
care for self. And I think that we get to this place, of course, as we should, when we have spouses or children, and we, selflessness, right? We are to give to those that we care for and we love. But at the same time, if we don't model what it means to slow down, to breathe, to keep the Sabbath,
mm-hmm.
then our children struggle with modeling that in their adulthood,
Oh
right?
yeah.
And so you've now set off a domino effect far beyond that one bad day you had at work.
Mm,
Now we're setting a culture, a tone in our household. Now we're setting generational standards. And so now you have a generation of very angry people, very unsettled people who are now out encountering one another and the earth. I mean, it is truly a domino effect.
it's a really great point, Domino. And just being with the earth, studying it, I can see that, I
Yeah,
can hear that,
yeah,
and I mourn that, and I mourn the ways that I participate. So I'm not on some
mhm,
high horse saying that
yeah,
this is just everybody else and I got to figure it out because I host some retreat. Part of the reason I do these is because this is my salvation at stake. I'm really
yeah,
trying to work through how does my restlessness show up and really harm others, not
yeah,
just humans. And but
mhm,
one of the beauties, one of the saving graces in my life, a gift God's given me, is that when I'm oftentimes playing from a real deep place, not superficially, not overly concerned about what somebody thinks, or am I playing enough, or is this
mhm,
good enough, or whatever. When I'm playing from that place of freedom, people were saying before Notes started, you play with such peace. This puts
mhm,
me at ease. And when I was confused about there's something I need to start, I
mhm,
couldn't put words to it at the time. When I was confused, I started to listen to that. I started to
yeah,
listen in and really tap into what people were saying and commenting about how they felt when I played.
mhm, yeah,
And then out of that, slowly but surely came this play on the words from music,
yeah,
notes,
yeah,
sound
yeah,
of rest,
yeah,
silence. And so sound and silence go together. It's also a place where you can really think about God and how where God is and God can be in the sound, God can be in the silence, God can be in the in between. And
Yes.
so it was a great place for that. But then also because I had this ultimate desire to really create these ecosystems of rest, it
Mhm.
then served as a way for me to think about how rest is something that's happening in all kinds of notes. A
Yeah.
note as it relates to music, a note
Mhm.
as it relates to the passage, either of
Mhm.
scripture I'm reading or of a
Mhm.
Black contemplative I'm reading, but notes also that we live with in the day to day,
Yes.
and when I have tons of plants, you see one right here,
Mhm.
tons of plants behind me. When I'm looking at those are moments, those are notes of
Mm.
rest to contemplate, though, to see that and to see a chord.
Yes. Yes.
That's a note.
Yeah.
That's a moment.
Mhm.
And we have those moments. We have access to those moments all the time. And I just think so much about how our ancestors, when they came over on boats and water became an enemy because water was the means by which they were being moved away from their homeland. Water became, but then also water was a balm and a refuge because some folk just jumped
Yes.
overboard and were collected by the sea. Water becomes complicated. The seagulls become complicated because they signal the arrival of a new place. So
Yeah.
on and so forth. Like nature takes on all these different places. And yet what's powerful is that we see how the enslaved ancestors were able to find notes of rest in the hum, you know,
In the
in the hull of the slave ship, on the
Yes.
plantation, singing,
Yes.
finding ways to really connect with the earth and with each other, and coming
Yes.
up with all the inventions that we did,
Yes.
over the course of generations.
Yes.
All of that speaks to how there are notes of rest resident within us in our story, and it's not just a story of mere torture and misery,
Yes.
but also of innovation, of
Mhm.
holding on, of
Mhm.
deep collective care,
Wow.
and of connection to earth. So
Yes.
one story that, well, should I share? I want to. I kind of want to share.
Please.
Okay, cool. So it's this really interesting thing that's happened with gospel music, where there's this professor Aubrey Hendricks who wrote this powerful piece about how Black music has shifted. And
Mhm.
one thing he's writing about in this piece, talking about the relationship between spirituals and the gospel music, say. So spirituals, 19th century, gospel music, he's really classifying in terms of 20th century and
Mhm.
21st. One thing he notes is different is that in the spirituals, there's far less emphasis on I,
Mm.
far more emphasis on we.
We.
Whereas in gospel music, there's far more emphasis on I
Mm.
versus we,
Mhm.
I/me.
Mhm.
part of he Part of what he sees as having happened is that in the 19th century, when the spirituals were being written, they were being written by communities who were working outside. These
Wow.
communities were outside working together in the cotton fields, picking tobacco,
Mm.
doing whatever they were doing, and they were therefore singing as a community, singing these work songs, these sorrow songs, all the kinds of ditties that came up and emerged into the canon of spirituals we have now. They were singing this amidst this time outside in the earth. And
Yes.
so they're thinking in the collective, they're together. It gives them a kind of creativity to be living with the earth, seeing the earth change. And it just makes a beautiful point about how being with organic matter like that allowed for a kind of therapy, even in the
Yes.
midst of the hell on earth that slavery was and
That's
is.
that's right.
But in the 20th century, those Black folk who were once outside now all of a sudden move inside. And so
Mhm.
they're singing to the same God,
Mhm.
but now they're in conveyor belts, working
Yes.
on conveyor belts in Detroit or,
Yes.
up and down the Mississippi.
Yeah.
And they're working in factories
Mhm.
because now the Industrial Revolution has led to that kind of life and that kind of work. Far fewer working on in agricultural settings.
Mhm.
And so then, and because of the kind of work that you're doing, the economic life also forms you. And so instead of the economics of the we
Yes.
on the plantation, you now have the economics of the me in the
Yes.
factory. And so you see how that then shifts in the music. And so
Mm.
one thing that we're saying here time and again throughout this whole time we've had on this heirloom call is that the music reflects also our relationship to the earth. It
Yes.
reflects how close we are to it. It reflects how communal we are with it. And that's one thing I'm hopeful to treasure
Yes.
and have be part of my legacy and responsibility is I can help be a mirror of a sort
Mhm.
to the culture about where we are with nature, how we sit with it, and how we sit with the God who made us and the
Yes.
rest of creation. So
Yes.
that
And
that was really helpful.
you made a timely transition into that space. I wanted to ask you a lot about gospel and the spirituals. And it's interesting because, I remember in the 90s, kind of this whole, it's just me and my Jesus, right? 80s,
Yes,
90s, maybe even 70s, me and my Jesus,
that's it.
me and my God, right? This personal relationship. And it sounds good until you realize it's pulled us from the collective. We've been pulled from it, and we've made that this the central to, excuse me, a theology, particularly a Trinitarian theology, that is already a group, right? God
Mm-hmm.
and God's self is community.
Whoo.
And we pull away from community,
I'm
we're
preaching.
pulling away from who God is, how God is comprised.
Yes, sure. Absolutely. There's that. And the fact that, way before modernity, in antiquity, in the patristics, which is this era of church
Mhm.
leaders in the 2nd century, 3rd century, church fathers in particular, these cats had a really global understanding of
Mm,
what Jesus had come to do.
mhm,
Jesus didn't just come to save you, little old you and little old
mhm,
me,
mhm.
but what Jesus was doing was actually changing the cosmos. You really changing the whole cosmos. I
Yeah.
mean, down to a cellular level,
Mhm.
this cat was changing things and
Yeah.
was restoring what had otherwise been marred by sin.
Yeah.
But to your point, due to all kinds of changes, and again, this is connected to politics, it's connected to economics, it's connected to how we become far more atomized in modernity. This
Yes.
is connected in part to philosophy, cats like
Yeah.
Immanuel Kant,
Yeah.
so on and so forth. John Locke, all these cats end up becoming a lot more concerned about what the individual can do, what the individual can own, and what the individual therefore is worth. And all
Right.
that's connected in politics and economics to then create, by the time you get to the 50s and 70s and
Mhm.
90s, this understanding of salvation that's about me
Mhm.
and Jesus.
Mhm.
So not only is it not about us as in
Right.
other humans and Jesus, and so again, to my point
Right.
about how there's far less
Mhm.
music
Mhm.
that really talks about the collective, the royal we,
Yeah.
far more about me, but also then it severed us from the rest of creation that Jesus joined. And
Yeah.
so I really mourn that kind of loss, that kind of attrition in terms of our sense of the collective, not alone with the
Mhm.
earth, but even other people.
Yes.
And so, what does it mean to make music that allows people to really attend to the ways that they're connected to all of creation, as
Yes.
opposed to just being preoccupied with one's personal atomized sense of
Yes.
self, as if we can even have that. Wendell Berry, the great thinker about about agriculture, has made a great point, and he said the smallest unit of health is the community.
Hmm.
And I think that's such an important point. And then of course you can certainly connect that to the earth being a part of your community, being a neighbor of yours.
Yes, powerful idea of neighbor. And I feel like, and this will take us to another tangent, so I won't take us this way. But when you mention neighbor, I've been challenged in recent days and weeks to begin to utilize neighbor when I'm referring to the person or thing that I cannot seem to naturally connect to,
Oh wow.
because God says to love our neighbor. So if I call this different person a neighbor, then I'm called into a relationship with them automatically.
Wow.
When we don't, and this is a global, right? Global neighbor, because we do realize now how small the world is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but we find, I don't know how we try to put galaxies between the person who is right
Mm,
next door or other nations, but we are literally sharing this one rock.
amen. Yeah.
We're
You know,
neighbors.
that's actually a really provocative point,
Yeah.
Dr. Mo, about what to do with animals that we don't like either.
I've had this conversation, and it's so funny. It's so funny because this is not a dialogue that we tend to have in Black spaces.
No.
This is a dialogue that I've only ever had in Caucasian spaces.
Yeah.
Um, the frustration of it is that, a lot of times the dialogue is so impassioned, and you wonder about
That's right.
if they could just use some of that energy to be concerned about the Black bodies. You know what I'm saying? The bodies of color. But it's like, okay, fine, fine.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know, the animals.
Right.
But you're right. Like,
Yeah.
we are such a cancel culture, and we're not just starting this. We've always been a
Mm,
cancel culture.
you preaching.
But we cancel out the things that just in our minds do not fit. And we eliminate them, and then something happens in our ecosystem, and then we get confused as to why
Mm,
things aren't right. So, I don't know, something as simple as, oh gosh, there are, I don't know, bees. And so we, burn them down, honeybees. Oh, they're bothering us. Next thing you
yeah.
know, we are in this deficit. We're having this issue with our food production because the bees have been interrupted. Their lives have been interrupted because we chose.
Ugh.
They just don't fit. And we
Wow.
do that with each other all the time. I can't figure out how you fit, so I'm going to eliminate you. I see no value in your life, in your breathing. And I just feel like if we understood connectedness in the way that God intended, which is how we were created, I don't think we would dismiss people the way that we do. I want to read a few statements. So we have Brianna from Growing Up Torres saying, listening and receiving. We were talking a little earlier about listening and receiving with intent. She said it's a constant work in progress for me. And I think it's all of us because we're no longer in a place societally where we honor what it means to listen and to hear. We may be getting back to it, but in the middle of all that we got going on, it's still deprioritized. And then she wanted to say, being aware that we are all having a shared experience on this earth helps to foster our sense of community. And I read recently that unfortunately, what we do is that we so quickly share our fears and our hatred. Most of our groups that draw together, we draw together because of the thing that we have in common that we detest and hate,
Wow.
instead of the thing that we honor and love. And I'm just like, okay, we have some work to do. We have some work to do. Yeah, I see your brain moving on.
Yeah. I just wanna play Hard
Please,
Hill right now.
this is a good time.
That was Brianna.
Brianna, yes, Brianna
Yes.
was.
Brianna, if you're still here, this is for you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
what you've inspired.
Thank you. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I heard conflict in there.
Mm-hmm. 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 Mm-hmm.
I heard
Mm-hmm.
promise.
Mm-hmm.
I heard promise.
Mm.
I heard conflict.
Yes. I was really trying to play the sorrow that Brianna was getting at. Yeah, Brianna, I don't know where you are. I don't know what you're going
Brianna
through.
gave hearts. Thank you,
Oh,
hearts.
oh
Yes,
wow. Oh,
she
you're
was still
welcome.
here. Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, Brianna, I don't know where you are in the world. And either sense, literally or figuratively.
Mhm.
But I just played that just in response to what you were saying about
Mhm.
listening and receiving and how we need that. Because yeah, you're tapping into something deep.
Yes.
And I think that's such a blistering critique of how we often seek to gather, because we
Yeah.
just seek to gather around what we hate
Mhm.
or what drains us, which then
Mm-hmm.
ironically, because we meditate on that, can just drain us even more. And I certainly nature, being in nature, I can hear God saying, watch out, be
Mm-hmm.
careful. I'll never forget when I almost broke my back, or even more. I was in Brazil, body surfing, and I was just way in over my head, and this wave took me. I was like, oh yeah, and then it crested. Lord have mercy. That could have been it. Um, but so there's definitely that side of nature, but on the other side, there's just this incredible ability to receive and to just be in awe and to listen, to use Brianna's language of listen and receive.
Mm-hmm.
That's possible. And when you see the biodiversity teaming in an area, and you
Mm-hmm.
see that those cats are there together because they actually want to grow together, my God, what a sermon.
Yes.
What a
Yes.
sermon that can be if we
Yes.
look through that frame, if
Yes.
we actually see that as worth keeping, worth protecting. Another things that Dr. Jennings talks about is that in the colonial era, we ended up shifting from nature and place as something that we could just behold and observe as such,
Mm-hmm.
to then something that needed to be always cultivated, always developed. And so even the language used now, development, we got to
Yes.
develop new condos or whatever, that we're always looking at something that otherwise would just appear as wild, as being not what it needs to be, as needing evolution.
Yes.
And I really lament that too. So some of that comes through in the sorrow about what we can't listen for and to, and what we can't receive.
Yes.
But
That's good.
there's a different way, and I
Mhm.
don't think it's a coincidence that, albeit agrarian culture, that Jesus, for me and my faith as a Christian, talks so much in terms of agricultural language to get at what he's trying to say
Mm.
about the organic life that God has for us,
Yes.
this abundant life. So
Mm. Beautiful.
yeah, there's a lot to meditate on.
There's a lot. There's a lot, and I loved how you were mentioning that the biodiversity and how these, how these microorganisms and all these these concepts, these living ideas. These, I mean, for us, they're concepts, we can't see them, but how
Yeah,
they live together. Because they want to, like, they know that in communicating
yeah.
properly they're going to produce something amazing. And it makes me think about all of the many attempts of Black communities to try to come together and
Hmm.
create this biodiversity in spaces that were not necessarily welcoming, right? In rocky soil, us being the rocky soil or the thorny soil, and Black communities have come together, and they've made these attempts. We talk about Tulsa this last year. Tulsa was a big conversation. I've had all of these spaces, these people coming to these spaces to attempt to create this biodiversity, this ecosystem, this beauty. And all I can think about, as you mentioned something like that, was someone coming, systems, and coming and like kicking a mound of ants and scattering the work,
Yeah.
scattering the ants. And it makes me think of that, that we've made these attempts. We have tried to come back together in our communities, to create and to be and to expand and to and to thrive. And systems continue to exist that kick our anthill,
Mm.
all the complexity and all the work that was created. And so we could go on and on and on with 10 minutes left, but go on and on about, how white supremacist systems have been created to kick all of these anthills, all these attempts at community that we know that we're naturally inclined to. We know that, but it kicks us back into, kicks us into the wind, into, north, south, east, and west. We just we settle there again in our separate
Mm.
spaces because we're exhausted, because we've tried.
Mm.
And that's kind of why, while I do find frustration sometimes, with we always do this, our community, we should be, it's not as if it has not been attempted before.
Sure. Yeah. I'm very careful. There's this really great musician. His name is Christian Scott, Tunde Ajua. And he said to me, when a new musician is like, oh man, I got this new sound, I got all these chords, or I'm doing this with the electronics, whatever, and they think that they're the bee's knees.
Yeah.
All he does is hit click, play, go back to the 70s, and you hear exactly what they're doing. And he's
Yes.
like,
There's nothing new under the sun, right? That's
if you
Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new under the sun.
if you think you're that novel, you haven't done your homework. And so I think in these movements around
Mm-hmm.
um, black rest, which is where I really am getting in at this,
Yes.
this reclamation of our relationship to earth.
Yes.
I know that it's been done, and cats are tired, and they've been ran out of places, and so on and so forth. And so I'm hopeful that I can continue learning about the deep lineage of what's been happening environmentally here in Chicago. I got a homie. She works for the city in the environment and does amazing work. Her name is Kyra Woods. Does an amazing work for trying to do new kind of environmental awareness. And one thing that's very morose but so real is we were driving once through Chicago South Side, which is predominantly black, and we were going through areas, and she was pointing out some stuff that she was considering, or the city was considering redoing. And she was saying, we were talking about AI and how all these rich white cats are going up now into space and what that is signaling. And she's like, yeah, when it comes down to it, I'm gonna be here with those who get left behind. I'll be here with my people. And I just thought that was so inspiring.
Yeah.
So inspiring to be committed to trying to make it do what it do, knowing that we're just up such a creek without such a paddle. And I think that's, faith is really where that comes in. And as my friend put it, this ain't it. Black faith has always been about saying, this ain't it. I don't know exactly what it is that we're going for, but this right here, this ain't it. And I think that's a beautiful way that has been used to push away the earth and just wait for understanding better by and by and the great after. But it also can be a great way to embrace the earth and embrace where we are now and say, this isn't it, but I'm seeing glimpses of what it can be. And I think that Jesus, when he was saying the kingdom has come, but it's also not here, I kind of see it, but I kind of don't. That's what I can see in some of the ways that we're trying still to reclaim earth, reclaim each other, reclaim connection, and then also live in the way that we're actually called to with others.
Right.
Again, all kinds of others, other kinds of folk, non-melanated or less melanated.
Yes.
As my wife puts it, melanated challenged. But then also, non-human creation.
Yeah.
And really, and not give up hope on trying to make that desirable.
Yes, right.
Of longing for a different kind of relationship to earth.
Yes.
And not being content with people who are like, I don't do outdoors and all that, realizing the trauma, realizing what might be behind that. Is this joke about Africans camping, and they're like, when you see Africans camping, talking about Africans in the US,
right,
it's so funny. It's like, that's so true. The REI commercials never have some cats, Nigerian immigrants, I'm saying, going out at a waterfall, and it speaks to a kind of white life and exploration. But be that as it may, how can we help people address said trauma in ways that actually connect us to the thing we come from? I observed Ash Wednesday, and I love observing Ash Wednesday because the ritual, when you get the cross with the ashes on your forehead, is, they say, from dust you have come, and to dust you shall return.
Yes.
We are,
and we do this once a year, but if we don't need that reminder daily, from dust you have come, and to dust you'll return, the humility in that.
Yes.
And then at the same time, recognizing the power of God to transform dust into civilization.
Yeah, that's powerful.
It's
That's
so
beautiful.
much power in that. So much power in that. I cannot believe we have like 6 minutes left. I want to give you 2 minutes, 2 minutes, and I just want you to, any musings you might have about this intersection.
Sure.
Take us home about this intersection, God, nature, music.
Yeah, I think that we can listen to music and think about where it's ultimately taking us.
Mhm.
Does the music help us see that we're inspired dirt? I don't
Mhm.
really know how that looks for you.
Mhm.
I'm asking that question now for myself, kind of in a way for the first time.
Mhm.
But am really interested in what it might mean for us to think about ourselves as inspired dirt. Here's one thought. In scripture, there is this idea of all of life being vain, or all of life being just a mere breath,
Yeah.
vanity.
Yeah.
The word in Hebrew is hevel.
Yeah.
Everything's hevel, and it's
Mhm.
all fleeting.
Yeah.
Well, one form of art that gets at that particularly well is music. Because
Mhm.
even with recordings, everything that you hear in music is fleeting. And in fact, part of the beauty of music, and Dr. Jeremy Begbie, a big theologian on music and theology, talks about this. If I just did this, that'd be, please stop that. That's
Mhm.
not music, right?
Mhm.
But if I did this, that was basically all the same notes I just played in the first moment.
Yes.
You'd be like, oh, where's that going? Is that
Right.
going to go into a song? Right? There's a different kind of intrigue because each one has its moment and then evaporates.
Yeah.
And Begbie talks about how we don't get music if we don't hear notes in their succession, not
Mhm.
always just bleeding all over each other, but
Yeah.
actually having their moment to breathe.
Yeah.
How might that then be a parable for the
Mhm.
kind of dustiness that we are?
Yes.
For us to realize that being inspired dust doesn't mean that we're worthless. You're lower than dirt, as we
Right.
often say,
Mhm.
but rather that God actually made us for a moment so that we become part of this beautiful tapestry that
Yeah.
is the sound of creation, the music of all creation.
Yes.
I think our relationship between God, music, and nature comes together when we see ourselves as inspired dirt, as something to cherish and
Yeah.
let others know about, so that those who think that they are lesser than can be
Mhm.
lifted up to the value of dirt, and
Yeah.
those who think that they are greater than it can be
And be
lowered.
lowered.
And that's the part
Yeah.
of the beauty of what I'm trying to be about. So thank you for giving space, and
Yes.
I hope that this has been helpful for you in your own walk.
For me, I'm deeply inspired, equally inspired and convicted to continue to
Mm,
be intentional in my life with allowing all of these things to allow God and nature
amen.
to speak. Hear when God and nature speaks, because God and nature are always speaking, but to allow myself to hear.
Hmm, hmm,
And I
hmm,
hope someone else has too. So this is what we'll do. I'm going to end with an affirmation. We're going to do an affirmation together, and then I want you to share with everybody, your information regarding your music and all
Sure.
that you're doing, and we're going to be done.
Sounds
Okay.
great.
So I tend to have this conversation at the very end of most of my it's not a podcast call dialogue, and I will start with the statement, "It is in my nature to."
Hmm.
And then I'll read one word and I'll just have you finish that statement with either a word or short phrase.
Yeah.
Okay. It is in my nature to see blank. It is in my nature to see what?
To see me, to see God, to see us.
Yes. It is in my nature to feel.
Rested.
Yes. It is in my nature to attract.
People who love.
Mhm. It is in my nature to reject.
Needless conflict.
That's it. It is in my nature to embrace.
God who made me.
It is in my nature to love.
Creation. But pray for me on that one.
Okay, got it. And finally, it is in my nature to be.
Whole.
Yes, yes. So, Julian, this evening, I want to thank you, and I want you to know that I will be in prayer that you and our Creator God will co create
Hmm.
space in this life where it is in your nature to see you, God, and all of us to feel rested, to attract people who love. to reject needless conflict, embrace God who made you, to love creation and to be whole. I
Mm.
pray that for you. And I pray that you and God continue to create that in your own space and all work that you do, um, in rest, in music, in it all.
Thank you. God bless you.
God bless you. What do you want to share regarding your music or your social media before we?
Sure. I'd love to stay in touch with you at Julian Davis Reid, just my name right here on the screen.
Mhm.
You can go to juliandavisreid.com to hear the album, also to read about Notes of Rest, my contemplative retreat that weaves together music, passages, and questions for the sake of stillness, introspection, and creativity for community so that we all may find rest. Also, I have a band, the Juju Exchange, and we have a couple records out. I have a record out of my own called Rest Assured, so you can hear all three of my projects. You can see that on the website, or the Juju Exchange is on all streaming platforms, and Julian Davis Reid is also on all streaming platforms. I look forward to being in touch with you. Thanks so
Perfect.
much.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful and restful evening. Enjoy the last couple of, no, last hour, maybe half an hour of the first day of spring. We thank you.